Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Today, Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Economic Development in South Africa received a briefing on the status and impact of broad-based black economic empowerment, which proves important insights into where the country is at in terms of increasing black participation in the economy. Joining me from Cape Town to discuss the findings is Duncan de Groot from Empowerdex. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us. Quickly tell us, who did you evaluate and how did they fare?
Thanks very much, Karima, and thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you. This morning we gave an overview to the Portfolio Committee on Economic Development with regards to the status and compliance of companies on the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Scorecard, as well as to give some input and insight into broad-based black economic empowerment and how that specifically relates to local procurement. What we showed the Portfolio Committee this morning was a snapshot of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange top 100 companies and their compliance with regards to the BEE scorecard. And what we showed was that on average, the score was just over 75 points, so a level 3. And the question we asked and the point we raised was whether this was a good approximation as to the performance of a developing economic development in the country.
Now, tell me, in terms of the snapshot, who was doing better? Was bigger companies doing better or smaller companies?
One of the challenges we had with the data was that it looked at large companies, and what we found is that large companies on the whole are highly compliant, and therefore there is a positive influence on the results that have been shown. So these were looking at the JSE listed companies and the large companies.
And what did you find in terms of the smaller companies, Duncan?
One of the challenges we face is the access to information with regards to the small companies. With large companies, we're able to go to their annual reports, we're able to get information off their publicly available information. One of the challenges we have at the moment is access to information from smaller companies, and it was one of the issues that was discussed and raised with the Portfolio Committee this morning.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at the fact that it's standing at 79%, this is compliance now, what to your mind is driving the compliance? Are companies finally taking government seriously on these codes?
The percentage was just over 75%, and the view that we have is that compliance is driven by the requirement to, the performance drives compliance, and it's not necessarily to the end of developing and promoting and creating sustainable and growing businesses. Compliance is the issue, and ensuring that the points are gained.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell me, we also talking about local procurement. It's very central to the understanding of broad-based black economic empowerment. What is the correlation in terms of what you found between local procurement on the one hand and broad-based black economic empowerment on the other hand?
A large part of the discussion in the meeting this morning revolved around local procurement. And one of the limitations of the codes at the moment is that there is no real measurement of local procurement. There is a measurement within the procurement element that measures 50% black-owned and 30% black woman-owned companies, but there is no look-through that 50% and 30% black woman-owned companies to determine whether they themselves are procuring locally. Mm-hmm. So one of the challenges is that local procurement as a concept isn't adequately addressed within the codes.
Now tell me, what do you ascribe that deficit to? Why is it that it is not adequately provided for, and do we perhaps need to change the way in which the code reads?
What we've found is that with the triple PFA and with the independent power producer projects that are coming into play now, is that there is a far greater emphasis on local content, and we're also of the understanding that the new codes that will be gazetted will contain aspects of local content. At the moment, they don't, and it it is a shortfall of the codes. But we do know that with other laws that are coming into play, that local content is going to be a far greater focus, and it needs to be.
Now, let's talk about the need for local procurement. We know, of course, that government has developed a new growth path, and local procurement is a huge part of it. Are companies beginning to understand what this means, just in terms of how they go about conducting their business? What are you guys finding?
We're finding at the moment that from a procurement perspective, clients aren't necessarily too concerned about the procurement beyond the supplier that they're interacting with. And one of the challenges that we face is that once we've measured procurement through a 50% black-owned or a 30% black woman-owned company, there's no measurement that shows beyond that point, do those suppliers themselves procure locally? All we're measuring, all that the codes measure at the moment, is at an ownership level. And is that company 50% black-owned and 30% black woman-owned?
In terms of the codes,
that again is a challenge that we face.
As it stands now, what has worked and what has failed in your estimation?
If we look at the 7 elements across the codes, we find that the elements that are the lowest performing, that carry the lowest scores, are those relating to human resources. We're looking at management control, we're looking at employment equity, and we're looking at skills development. Whereas those that score the highest are socioeconomic development, which is also perhaps the easiest one to comply with, as well as preferential procurement and enterprise development.
And what is the reasons for this breakdown as you've explained it?
Certainly socioeconomic development is reasonably easy to comply with, and the measurement criteria for procurement, enterprise development and socioeconomic development themselves is a reasonably narrow measurement. With enterprise development and socioeconomic development, it's a percentage of your net profit after tax, whereas with procurement it is a percentage of what's known as the total measured spend. So provided a company is prepared to spend a percentage of their net profit after tax on enterprise development or socioeconomic development, either in a monetary or in a non-monetary means, they will be able to comply. Whereas if we look at the human resource aspect, if we look at management control and employment equity and skills development, it requires a far greater focus from the side of the measured entity, from the client, in order to continually improve those scores.
Why do you think we're having a problem with human resources, given the fact that we've had, employment equity laws on the statute book since the 90s?
It's one of the areas we raised with the Portfolio Committee this morning to say that we found it strange that on the whole, employment equity was a relative poor performer compared to some of the other elements, despite the fact that employment equity laws have been on the statute since the 1990s. What we are finding is that at junior management level, and now we're talking for companies who've got a turnover greater than 35 million rand, what we're finding is at junior management level, there is fairly good compliance. But as we go up into the higher areas within the business, middle management, senior management, and even for that matter, top management, that the representation and the compliance falls off.
Mm-hmm. Is that perhaps to do with the fact that you have very high level of turnover of black staff, at a very high skilled level? Because we often hear companies saying, we've invested so much in people, but they don't really stay, we can't retain them in companies.
I haven't seen empirical data to back that, but it is an argument that could hold water.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the big questions around broad-based black economic empowerment, of course, is the question of fronting. What has the report found, on this issue?
Fronting is a complex issue, and as far as a verification agency is concerned, it is also a very difficult aspect to establish. What we as a verification agency is required to do, as are all accredited verification agencies, is to ensure that we have evidence on file that proves the ownership credentials of a company, which includes inter alia registration papers, certified IDs. We're required to do ownership, we're required to do interviews with those equity shareholders. And generally, at a measured entity level, the information and the evidence is satisfactory to define the black ownership within that measured entity. Mm-hmm. Where it is more difficult is beyond that point, where from an operational perspective, where that company might not have the ability to carry out a job, but purports to have the ability to do it, and that is potentially where the fronting aspect comes in. But from a measured entity, from a verification perspective, it is a very difficult and complex area to unequivocally state that fronting is taking place.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you are to be able to measure fronting more accurately, what would need to change for you to be able to actually do that investigation properly?
As I said, at the moment, the role of a verification agency is to measure the ownership within a measured entity. However, if we were to try to look further beyond that, we would need to go and I believe we would need to take into account the ability and the operational capacity of a company to carry out the work that they have purported to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's get back to that quick snapshot of the performance. It shows 80% in terms of ownership, but 59% in terms of management and control. Does this suggest that there's perhaps an overemphasis on ownership?
It's one of the areas that we have said carries perhaps too much of an ownership. We're certainly not saying that ownership should not be a measurable element. However, we are saying that ownership should not be the be-all and end-all of the elements to be measured, and to determine that whether, if your ownership percentage is good, is broad-based black economic empowerment effective. Our view is that we need to make sure that we are putting the focus with those elements that are struggling. And those, as I said, tend to fall into the human resource area.
Okay, we're taking a short break now, but when we return, we continue our conversation with Duncan de Groot from Empowerdex on broad-based black economic empowerment.